And good morning, everybody. We're live. Welcome. You made it through the week. Congratulations. Pull up a chair. Join us for today's Food Safety Chat Live. If you're new to the show, this is a discussion of all things food safety. And every Friday, I bring on a guest. And today, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Darin Detwiler on the show with me here today. Darin, how are you today?
Good, good, good. Yourself?
Oh, not too bad. Not too bad. We had some pretty chilly weather here in Colorado over the weekend. I think 2 nights ago it was like 15 below. So trying to encourage the dog to go outside and do his business, not the easiest thing in the world to do. He's a little Yorkshire Terrier, so they're pretty strong-willed as it is. So, but as is typical for Colorado this time of year, it gets cold. It'll snow a little bit, and then it's going to be 50 degrees tomorrow. So all it's good for the moisture level and making my car really dirty. And one of the things with the chat that we love to do here as well is let us know where in the world you're watching from. I'm in Loveland, Colorado. I'll throw that here in the chat. And Darin, where are you at today?
I'm in Los Angeles, California area.
Ah, and of course, it's 8 o'clock here at this time of the recording in Colorado, which is 7 a.m. for Darin on the West Coast. So thanks for getting up early and joining us for this as well.
I didn't have any
Um,
choice.
that's true. That's true. And I greatly appreciate that.
It's
Um,
it's my pleasure.
so one of the things that we wanted to talk today about, and I'm very grateful, Darin, that you decided to join us today during this week, is this is the 30th anniversary of the passing of your son Riley with E. coli.
Yeah, I mean it's weird to think, the numbers are there that it's been 30 years, and it's amazing how many times I've done the math in my head.
Oh,
But here we are looking at uh, 30 years beyond this event. Um, back in 1993, and I can put myself back in that space in 1993. And you think 30 minutes, a day, 3 days, a week into the future, you're struggling to think that far into the future. And I never really thought in terms of the idea of, we would still be dealing with outbreaks like this um, 30 years later. But the idea that I would still be playing this role,
yeah.
it's just it offers a lot of reflection opportunities at this point this week.
Yep, definitely. And one of the things with this is, and I think it's something. And this is why, as we were preparing for this call, today is that a lot of times food safety becomes something that's an academic process. Oh, there was a recall and there was X number of illnesses, and God forbid someone dies during the recall, um, and it just becomes something that is academic. And I think what's really important about what you've done in these type of activities is it's personal. These are people. That person in that photograph behind you was a person. And that's why I think what we do is so very important. And everything that you do in this field is greatly appreciated. And we're very thankful that you took up this mantle over this last 30 years. So wanted to raise my cup to you today, Darin.
Well, thank you very much.
And so I think as we were preparing for this as well, is that 30-year period, and what happens during that period of time. And there are markers that occur in our lives, things that are highly memorable, things that shape who we are and how we do things. I know it's definitely my case as well. And when Jack in the Box and this E. coli event happened, I was just starting out in my career, and it had a huge impact on me, and it really focused me around just how important food safety is. And uh, I think that's part of the calling, and likely why I continue doing what I do today as well. And that perspective and that shifting point, we need to be aware of those and really then take a look at those and figure out how can we move these things forward and not let them fade away.
Well, I sometimes recall how at one point the 93 outbreak was referred to as the 9/11 of the meat industry.
Mm,
And I get that, but realize that, on 9/11, some 3,000 souls perished. Um, and yet, with failures in food safety when it comes to foodborne pathogens, there's some 3,000 Americans that die every single year.
mm,
And I don't mean to diminish or belittle anyone involved in 9/11, but when you look at the idea of, if we had literally a 9/11 every year, over and over again for 30 years, how would the nation react to certain things? And yet we have the seemingly unending chain, in the endless chain of failures, and we look for reform, we look for technology, we look for policies, we look for laws, and you know, the public has become far more aware of these things. It's not the shock of 1993, it's the what's next or what now or what this time kind of
mhm.
response to failures in food safety that we see not only permeating the news but social media.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that yeah, what's going to happen next, and we see these new emerging threats that seem to happen and just keep repeating. The one that catches my attention recently is enoki mushrooms. If you're watching this, right, it just appears, it's like almost every week now, Darren, there's a new recall of enoki mushrooms for listeria. So everybody avoid enoki, don't eat those. Um, so part of what when we were preparing for this chat as well too, is kind of this progression of time and these activities. And to your point, with these different things that are coming up constantly, we tend to get um, insulated from them, for lack of a better word. But I mean, really, there's kind of three categories that we were looking at for these type of watershed moments, these life-changing events, and how they impact communication and how those are distributed. And I think a good example of this is kind of direct and indirect, and then the third person is how I kind of categorize these. So the example we were kind of working through was World War II. So our grandfathers, great grandfathers now in cases, were active combatants in World War II, and they had stories and they experienced it firsthand as you have, and no one can ever replicate that. That information then is with them, and it has a profound impact on that person, and that's their direct experience. A lot of times then that information gets passed indirectly. So a lot of what we're doing here would be indirect communication of that information. And you've done a great job of helping to educate people around this and share your experience and communicate how that experience, that direct uh, crisis and massive failure of food safety impacted your life to this day. And as time goes forward, these things move, and our grandparents from World War II pass on, and that direct link is gone, and then things move into more of the third person academic world where you're watching biographies on YouTube, or you're reading books about a particular battle in World War II or things like that, and it becomes impersonal. It doesn't have those connections. And one of the things that we talk about on this chat quite a bit is those two spheres of how we need to look at how we do our jobs, which is the technical information, and then the personal side of things, which is why we do these things. Everything that we're doing here is for people, to make sure that we're caring for them and taking the correct steps to ensure their health and their safety, and then that can never waver. And those three categories, I think, are really, really important to think about this information. So part of this, and the main topic for our discussion today, is how do we keep this moving forward?
Yeah, well, I'm a submarine veteran, and I am just blown away by the conversations I have with World War II submarine veterans. And I'm part of a group where there used to be 75, 100 submarine veterans from World War II. Now there's only like two or three, and there'll be a point where there's no more living submarine, or well, World War II veterans or submarine veterans from World War II. And then that's where you have the second phase, the idea of those people who interacted with those people. But at some point in the future, there will be a generation that came about after the last World War II veteran uh, passed away. And that becomes yet this again, like you take everything is third person. No, nothing is having direct contact. And so I look at this in terms of companies, um, and experts within food safety. There's so many people I talk with that oh, I know exactly where I was in 1993. This changed my focus in university, or this changed my career trajectory. I focus on food safety in my career. And we can look at companies that in this case we can look at Jack in the Box and say, look, after this event in 1993. Jack in the Box invested a lot of money and effort into food safety under this idea of they never want this to happen again. And since then, Dave Thino, being very noted for what he did in terms of food safety and science, specifically with Jack in the Box, he has passed away. And those at the helm of this company are not the ones who were at the helm 30 years ago. In fact, none of the people in highest executive positions in 1993 are still in those roles today. But, to look at the idea that it's been 30 years and, they can talk about their company and certain elements, values, and where they're at. But if you start saying, well, wait, 30 years from now, right? In 2053, it's very likely that anyone who is at the helm of a company was not even born in 1993. How will they make sure that the values and the motivations and the momentum in food safety that we've seen build over the last 30 years will continue if they're so disconnected from the why? So disconnected from that 9/11 that was in 1993. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we don't just see this like, oh, it's all new all over again, as opposed to let's continue with this momentum and have a strong compass as to
Mhm.
how we go forward. These are the kind of conversations we need to start having with not only food safety experts, but with industry and even with new students who are, whether it's food law, food science, or what have you. We need to start talking about the idea of legacy with them as well.
Right. And in some way, what we're talking about here as well is food safety culture. Right? How do you build these programs? How do you build these systems? How do you build that experience, that direct communication into your company so that it becomes part of who they are, just not something that happened and then everybody forgets about it? And that's a gigantic challenge to do that.
Well, when I talk with families who are dealing with a child in the hospital or who have recently buried a child, it's amazing how many times I hear the phrase, uh, you know, something to that effect 30 years ago. The
Mhm.
idea of, it's 1993, this is the United States of America. How can this be happening? But when we look at the idea of what industry typically does, right? And it's not just industry, but the kind of the human nature of things. We'll hold on to the bright spots. We'll hold on to those things we want to celebrate. Our greatest record sales, or whatever it is, right? But in order for us to truly show that we value food safety, it's not just a belief, right? Because a belief is temporary. A belief is a path.
Yeah.
Anyone can say they believe in things. How many companies have had failures and they say, "Oh, but we believe in food safety. We believe that food safety is a priority." Okay, but it was truly not a value. It was truly not a value that you held as that much of a priority, because if it was a value, then you would have made some different decisions along the way, right?
Right.
But we look at the idea of the history of a company. If we look at the legacy, right, down the road, we have to look at the history. These companies have to hold on to not just those bright spots, they have to hold on to those dark moments. They have to hold on to those conflicting themes as part of their history, as part of the why behind why they invested in this, why they prioritized this, why they made these decisions and why these need to be persistent in where they go forward. Because if they don't, right, that generation after generation of leadership is not going to be connected to those, and the rest of the food safety culture and community around them is going to go, oh, remember when that company prioritized this and they really valued, they did all this work in food safety, and look at them now, you know. Or worse, oh, it's okay for us to forget about food safety because it's almost as if, you know, it was an extreme value to us, but it had an expiration date. I don't think that anyone talks about values today and thinks about the idea of an expiration date. I think about the work that I do and I have done, and I've never thought about it as having an expiration date. Um, um, and I don't want to think that industry would think that as well.
No, I think that's an excellent point. Because, yeah, when something bad happens in the company, they immediately want to forget about it, push it under the rug, and pretend like it never happened, and go back to their business as usual and pretend. And maybe that's a big chunk of the reason why we keep repeating these things, because we're unable to learn from those mistakes. I saw a presentation with the head of quality at Cadbury Chocolate, and they had a big recall in their UK plant for salmonella in their chocolate. And he was giving his presentation and actually going through and showing where the failures occurred in his plant. And he got to one particular slide, and it was a zoom in of a conveyor belt, and there was like chocolate going along this belt, and there was a pipe above it. It was a drain pipe, and he said, "See this teeny tiny little hole? This pipe goes to the roof, and this was for water, rainwater, to shunt it off to the side. This little hole in this pipe cost us, I forget what it was, $5 million. This was the source of our food safety failure." And then he went back through the story of how this happened and what they think occurred and how the salmonella got into the plant. There was a bird processing facilities farther upstream from this facility, and that's where they think it came from. But that event stuck with me because he was willing to go to a conference, speak to hundreds of people, and stand up in front of them and say, "Here's how we failed. Don't do this. You need to go back to your operations and look at this in your plants and make sure this isn't happening to you." And I thought that was great.
Yeah, but the reality that I see, and I'm sure that many of us are aware of this, is that you have that company that'll stand up, they'll have a person who'll stand up in front of an audience and say, here's where our failure took place, and here's the lesson we learned. But for every one company like that, you're going to have a handful of companies that, given that same opportunity, they'll stand up in front of an audience or they'll get in front of a magazine or a camera and they'll say, hey, we're investing in environmental issues now. We're doubling down in our commitment to community, and we're helping nonprofits, and we're gonna boost our support of startups, and we're gonna start a college fund for our new employees. It's like you just it's PR 101, change
Yeah.
the script, focus on something else. And it's like, okay, how about what everyone is thinking you really should be talking about, which is that idea of root cause analysis, lesson to learn, and what are you going to do going forward? And I think from a consumer perspective, the trend in media is, and we saw this with Chipotle, and we saw this with Jack in the Box, and we saw this with romaine lettuce, and we saw this with Bluebell creameries, and I can name company after company. Um, you know, Within a few months after a major outbreak or recall or whatever, the media coverage. How will this company economically rebound from this? How will this company, you know, uh, you know, start making profit again? And that's the like the trade magazine, the industry, the journalistic kind of viewpoint. Um, what I fail to see quite often is, how will these consumers who are impacted recover? How are they doing? How is the food safety culture responding to this? No one tends to talk about that nearly as much as they'll focus on the idea of, but the company's going to come back, right? And I'm
Mhm.
sure for those employees and those executives that is important. But we have to make sure that we establish, build, and maintain, and can restore trust between these food companies and consumers. Otherwise, it's just, again, it's going to be this, rinse, wash, and repeat in terms of the food safety failure of the week.
Yeah, exactly. And there, to your point, the examples of companies that don't follow that path far outweigh the ones that do, right? So the classic textbook example is Tylenol, right? Where Tylenol had the tampering issue. They went out publicly and talked about it, explained what was going on. As they learned new information, they would immediately share that with the public. And that only helped to bolster their brand. And it gave, and to your point, that trust, they were able to establish that trust with the public.
Isn't it wild though that there is a scenario where people in the know look back at that and they don't see that as a failure of that company or of that industry or that commodity. They talk about the leadership that that company demonstrated at the time. And yeah, I mean, there's people that can go, oh, I remember when there wasn't all the safety seals and all the triple sealed stuff that we have today and stuff like that. And yeah, there were major changes in industry as a result of that.
Yeah.
But but why don't we have nearly the same number of changes in food safety as as we've seen here? I know of companies that um, if you are a if you're when you have franchisees, right? You have different restaurants. Some restaurants are um, owned by the company, and some are just franchisees that are loosely owned by the companies. And it's weird to me that it's the same name and same logo on either one. That doesn't change. But if you're a restaurant that's owned by the company, you're required to use time and temperature controls to make the hamburgers. Whereas if you're a franchisee, you're not, and they just check the oven temperature every 2 hours. It's
Mm.
it's like, why are you having a different level of standards and requirements based on the fact that it's not a company, a restaurant, it's a franchisee? Um, and so many other examples where it's like, well, why is it that in this state you require this, but in that state you don't? Or why is it that for this audience you require this, or for this group of consumers you require this, but for that one you don't? So, looking at the idea that food safety should not be a premium, and food safety should not change based on your zip code,
Yeah.
or some weird classification of a restaurant. Um, is some of the patterns that we have seen emerge over the past 3 decades. Um, that and the fact that consumer behaviors changed definitely over the last 5 years of the pandemic, and that as we continue to see disruptors, whether it's an ingredient from a company or a process from a company, or disruptors in terms of now consumers can do it this way or they can get the food that way, there's always going to be new challenges in terms of food safety. And when I'm in meetings with food safety experts, what I hear time and time again is that some of the greatest challenges come from within. It's marketing, or it's the people focusing on labeling, or it's these different challenges in terms of, you just can't make that claim, or you can't do this. This impacts our validation process, or the idea of the certifications we have. You can't make false claims in terms of certifications. um, all these different elements start impacting that consumer face of what it is that is there to build a reputation and trust around food safety with a company. So it's not just literally pathogens that are the issue in terms of food safety. Um, I think consumers today are asking far more questions. Whether it's food quality, that may or may not have anything to do with food
Right.
safety, and even within food safety, how food allergens is much a bigger of a role today than it was 30 years ago. We can look at food defense, like bioterrorism and economic adulteration and sabotage. Obviously, food security, like sustainability and actual nutritional value. And authenticity, is it counterfeit? Is it the real thing? Kind of a deal. There's a lot more questions that consumers are asking today. They're even asking questions that have really nothing to do with food safety. Like, when you look at the idea of an executive who makes racist comments, or who donates money to this political campaign or that campaign, or this issue or that issue. Do they allow women to breastfeed in the restaurant? Do they allow people to bring guns in the restaurant? Um, all these different kind of factors that play a decision in people's or plays a role in people's making a decision in terms of what brand, what company, what product to eat, even if they have nothing to do with food safety. Today, the world of consumer behavior is far different than it was 3 decades ago.
That's a really good point. And that can also work to our detriment because we're flooded with so much information. We don't necessarily know what's true and what's not. And within food companies, things get started out there, and rumors, or oh, this particular ingredient can cause a disruption in your hormone system or something, and then companies get flooded with this from these sites, because a lot of times too, there's advocacy groups that out there that are there to build a membership, and they want to make wild claims and things like that that they may not necessarily have evidence for, but that gets eyeballs. And sometimes companies have to work with those too, and that can be very, very difficult. It's like with doctors, who have patients who come in and say, well, I read this and this and on the internet, and it's just like, oh, now the doctor's kind of got to work his way through that and explain why these different things that they're saying may or may not be true. So a lot of times that information can muddy the water, which I think also then, Darin, gets back to our point for today, which is why it's so important to have that food safety messaging front and center within a company so that people don't forget these things. We get caught up in individual basis and on a company basis. And to your point with marketing and sales and things like this, a lot of times, and I saw this in food companies a lot, is a lot of your new offerings are built around the reset times on the shelves for retailers. So if Target does shelf reset in Q3, well, then scheduling works backwards from that. Oh, okay, well, if we're going to hit that reset, now we need to do this. And that means we got to do everything really fast in order to hit that deadline. That can cause problems, right? So that messaging internally then needs to be, okay, we can hit that if we can, but there's certain things that are non-negotiable, and food safety is one of those. And those messages need to be put forward very strongly. Because if you don't, it's just assumed that it's happened. And we all know if you do that, that's the path to failure.
Well, I think along with that, I mean, there's other challenges. I think one of the things that came to mind was this idea of, you look at the third party delivery of food, right? And what have we seen? I have literally seen a lawyer stand in front of restaurant executives and say that you should embrace third party delivery companies because they impart the idea of shadow of a doubt. If there was a problem with food allergen or with food safety, is it the restaurant's fault or is it the delivery person's fault? It's like, that's a horrible, loophole to try to find
Yeah.
out there. And I was just blown away by this. And I stood up and said that this is not, I think, the direction you want to go in. But what we do see is we see restaurants that prepare the food and they'll put it onto, wait for someone to pick up that order. Who knows how long that stays there, and how long the temperature is now, out of the safety range. No one's tracking that, and when you receive it, you don't know if it was, you know, cooked within 2 minutes of your order and sat around for 45 minutes, or if it was not cooked for 45 minutes and it's only been in transit for 2 minutes. When we have those boxes of ingredients that are delivered to people's houses. There's a lot of conversation around those meal kits. The idea of, how do we know about time and temperature control for, either keeping things cool or keeping things separated and allergens. There's a lot more questions that consumers have today about these steps. I'm working with the National Environmental Health Association and other groups that are working to try to help put resources into consumers' hands in terms of how to deal with these delivery and package kits and that kind of thing. And yet I keep seeing all these social media videos are like, you know preparing your own food is a waste of time, it's so complicated. It's like, okay, what a weird message. It's like, do you remember when there used to be the joke, like those TV commercials, um like is it hard for you to open a container of milk and you see the person like struggle and then rah, milk flies all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Or do you struggle to put on glasses? Ah, kind of a thing. It's like, look, try not making us out to be so incompetent and not capable of doing things. It's so hard to plan your own meals and make your own meals at home, kind of a thing. And yet you go back in terms of the last 3 decades of food safety. When I was working with the USDA to get food safe handling labels that you've seen for well over 25 years on packages of raw meat and poultry, the meat industry opposed it vehemently. And you know what their argument was? The American consumer knows very well how to prepare this at home.
Mm,
When you look at the antibiotic resistant salmonella and chicken, and how hard it was to, I mean, well, now we have it in terms of like if it's breaded chicken or stuffed chicken, but not for raw chicken. You go back to the actual ruling from a judge many years ago on this, and when the lawsuit came up, and when it was voted for the industry that they don't have to do this, right? The judge literally says that women, not just consumers or cooks or people, right? But women in the kitchen know how to cook this stuff. Therefore, we don't have to do this. And you look at the idea of, is it our responsibility or is it the consumer's responsibility? Why is everyone always blaming the or the companies when they should be looking at the onus of responsibility on the consumer? You can't have it both ways. You can't have a scenario where the responsibility is all on the consumer, and yet we have companies that are now saying cooking's too hard. You know, People too lazy, too stupid to cook. Just buy our pre-cooked things, kind of thing. You can't have it both ways. We're
right.
either capable of doing this ourselves and we have the ability to make educated decisions, and we should have all the information when it comes to safety and precautions, and we can be responsible as a stakeholder, a participant along the way from the farm to the fork, not shouldering all the responsibility, not shouldering no responsibility, but what is that relationship between us? We've also seen, you were talking about 30 years, about 2015 or so is when the U.S. Department of Labor and Statistics put out that Americans now spend more money on food prepared outside of the home than they do spend on food prepared inside the home, that they're going to prepare themselves. We
Mm,
have to take that into consideration in terms of consumer behavior and where food safety truly needs to be supported throughout the entire journey of food and of food safety from farm to fork.
yeah, that's a good point. And then, circumstances that are beyond our control. So COVID. So now all these people who don't know how to cook because they're eating out of the home all the time are now stuck at home and they got to figure out how to cook. And they don't necessarily know that, hey, that cutting board you used to cut up that raw chicken, don't use that for anything else, right? No, who teaches them that, right?
Yeah. Well, and if you look at just all the social media videos and the cooking shows and stuff like that, right? They focus on the sexy parts of the cooking it, right? They don't
Yeah.
focus on the, hey, maybe you should wash your hands and have clean utensils and a clean cutting surface, and swap out the board that you use to cut the knife, and not use the same. I'm sorry, the board and knife you use to cut the meat, and use a different board and knife to cut the salad ingredients, right? And by the way, here's how you should use a thermometer, and here's how you should store your leftovers, and here's how long you should store. There's a lot of other details that kind of like, for the interest of time, get cut out of that conversation. And it's amazing that the details that get cut for the interest of time are usually the ones that are the most critical in terms of food safety.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, they prepare the turkey in the pan and then it goes to commercial and it comes back and it's like, oh, our turkey's done, and they pull it out of the oven. And
Yeah,
it's
it's
just
like,
like,
well, it's done.
yeah,
And so that also tells, like the idea of, you didn't wait the time and you didn't use the thermometer to make sure it was done. You took it out when it was convenient, a kind of a situation. And so, yeah, we've got an industry that I think has a responsibility. If you're going to tell us we should be doing this, then tell us how we can be doing it safe. How many times have people looked at cookbooks and, I've looked at cookbooks and there's no mention about food safety whatsoever.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm not saying that there should be a national law about, cookbooks must have food safety conversations, but one would think that if you're going to put out, all these steps, that you might as well put out the right steps. How do you know it's cooked properly? How do you know it's cooked fully? And that idea of taking into consideration a that are you cooking it for healthy adults or are you cooking it for your family? And by the way, you've got your great grandma over for dinner, and you've got your pregnant sister, and you've got her two toddlers or your two toddlers, and now you have a house full. Oh, by the way, and Uncle Joe's over, and you haven't seen him because he just had a heart surgery. So now you've got a house full of very vulnerable consumers that are the ones that are most likely to become sick from a foodborne pathogen. And you got to take that into consideration. So there's a lot more to the conversation that typically doesn't get included out there, and I think it's critical.
Yep, no, you're absolutely right, and that's that part of that teaching the next generation. My wife and I like to go out, and if we're eating out at a restaurant, we like sushi. And the number of times I've been in a sushi restaurant, and I'll look over at a table, and there'll be a family with young, really young children, feeding those children raw sushi, and I'm just like, oh, no, what, no, no, what are you
Yeah.
doing? Oh my goodness, they just, yeah, not a thought. And that messaging becomes so important in teaching this, right? Getting that direct experience message out there with people. And another good example I think that came to mind of being able to pass that information on from generation to generation are the Jewish people. And they've been able to take an absolutely horrendous, horrible situation where 6 million of their people were murdered, and teaching those generations. And that happened, a long time ago. And we even have a name for it, right? The Holocaust. And when you say that, everybody knows what that is. And it doesn't matter that those people were Jewish. And they're like, we will never forget. We will always pass this message on. We will always teach our children, because we will never, ever, ever allow that to happen again. And that's what we need to be doing with food safety. Is we cannot let these things happen.
You brought up a very good example because with the Holocaust, because what have we also seen? We've seen Holocaust deniers, and we've
Yeah.
seen people who basically, oh, this is my Holocaust. It's like, no, that's a completely different scenario. Don't bastardize the use of the word Holocaust, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Remember, we saw during the recall, and with um, Bluebell Creameries, and ice cream was taken off of the shelves, and there were people up in arms about this. Oh, how dare you take my Bluebell Creamery out of my, you can't take it out of my cold dead hands, and how dare this is a slap to Texas in the face and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. We stand by this company no matter what. And it's like, okay, but you can't deny the fact that people are being harmed by this because they've already admitted to this failure and that they lied to the consumers. They lied to their stockholders about their food safety stuff. And these people, but we've had a long relationship in the United States of America in terms of food safety. You look at the idea of World War II propaganda posters,
Mhm.
and there was a series of, I think, six or so posters from the U.S. Public Health Department during World War II. It talked about washing your hands and not cross contaminating, and these are awesome, but it's all women. Right, it was a woman's responsibility to deal with food safety and health issues, kind of a thing. You get into the 80s and 90s, and meat. It's what's American, and beef. It's masculine, and that kind of stuff, right? And
Mhm.
you still get into this idea that if you're a real man, you should eat it raw. It should still be mooing, kind of a thing. And
Yeah.
you look at there was a restaurant for a long while called Bar 145, I believe, and it had a series of outbreaks. But the reason why it was called Bar 145 is they believed that it was a crime to humanity to cook beef to any temperature above 145. And it's like, well, okay, so you're just eliminating any kill step there. So if you're talking about a piece of steak, okay, sure, you get it. But when you're talking about hamburger or mechanically tenderized beef, where any pathogens on the outside are now on the inside, and here you've got these governments telling you, and you've got these health officials, and you got this food safety community telling you that you need to cook it to a proper temperature, and they're like, no real man would want to eat that. It's like, how did masculinity get caught up in the conversation of food safety? Even when I started 30 years ago, there was a masculinity issue. I was referred to by some people in the meat industry as the crying mom who wore pants.
Oh, jeez.
And I was working with TV executives. They actually wanted to make a TV movie about the outbreak. And ultimately, we go out to Los Angeles and we meet with them, and they tell us they're not going to move forward with the project because there wasn't enough sex and violence to sell it to a mainstream audience. But they had a couple ideas that could work. First off, it'd be better if it was told from a single mom's point of view, that I wasn't in the equation whatsoever. Because a woman's struggle, it would make more sense. But if I was in the picture, then they said, well, what if I either I resorted to drugs because I couldn't deal with the death of my son, or I resorted to violence and I got my hands on some guns, and I went into the restaurant and I shot up everyone who I thought was responsible for the death of my son. It's like, how did masculinity and drugs and violence now become part of a narrative that never took place, when all I'm trying to do is prevent other parents, male or female or both, right?
Yeah.
Um, from living with a chair forever empty at their family table. It was weird how definition of American and masculine and male and gender and sex roles got caught up into these early years of the messages about food safety.
Holy moly. That's outrageous. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why I always laugh when we'll watch like a true crime show or something. It's at the beginning. It'll always say based on the true story, and you're like, okay, yeah, there was this guy and this lady. That's pretty much where it stops. Right?
Yeah.
Everything else is in question. You have no idea if this really happened or not. They're trying to present it like it did, but it probably didn't. Ugh.
Well, I think
So
one of
yeah,
the most shocking things too, in addition to the sex and drugs and violence and all that kind of stuff, was that they also said, you know what would also make a better story that we could potentially work with here, is if your son lived. And it's like, yeah, that would make a better story. But the
yeah, I
reality
would.
is
Yeah,
that he didn't live, and that in this case, there were four children who didn't live. And in every case, you look at these numbers of people impacted. You look at the idea that, yes, there are people who survived, but there is also some 3,000 Americans who die every year. And most of them are either very young or very elderly. But we also look at listeria outbreaks involving deli meats and
hmm,
ready to eat foods. And inevitably, when you look at the CDC final report on an incident like that, I always look for the miscarriages. Those always exist. But the number that people, and that the story that people don't often tell, is the people in the middle. Yes, they were discharged, and yes, they survived, but they're going to live with lifelong medical complications. They may not be able to have the same cognitive or even physical development that they should have had from if they hadn't got sick from a foodborne failure, a foodborne pathogen. I know people who, when they were very young and on dialysis at a pediatric intensive care unit, had a stroke and now can't use an arm, or they can never speak the same. I know of this one woman who, she shared the guilt that she lives with, because everyone's like, "Oh, you should be so lucky your daughter survived. You should be so lucky your daughter survived." And she told me in confidence about how much guilt she feels, because when her daughter was 2 and survived, yes, definitely, lucky and feels fortunate that she survived. But she'll never talk, she'll never walk, she'll never live on her own, she'll never, be anything other than, even though it's been all these years later, she's still physically and cognitively this 2-year-old. And to paraphrase what the mother told me, it's as if this is not the, it's as if my daughter died and all the dreams I had about this daughter died, and this is some other person. I know it's my daughter, but she will never have anything that resembles a quality of life that matches what she had before. So again, we
Mm.
often talk about the people who survive and the people who die, but we rarely talk about the people who, their lives will never be the same, and they're going to live with the ultimate, it's almost like a scarlet letter, if you will, of this food safety failure. And yet, again, the media will often focus on, oh, it's so good that the company rebounded. That they came back from this financially crippling moment in their time, but they never talk about those victims who will never have an opportunity to go back to the way things were before.
Yeah, and this gets back to kind of what we're talking about here today, that direct line of communication of someone who is impacted with issues like this we never hear from, right? They're, the lawyers all get together and they go to court, and and then it's gone. We never hear from these people. It becomes
They're
very.
the cases are settled out of court. You never see major cases. In fact, the Peanut Corporation of America was one of the first times we really saw the idea of food safety in the courtroom to that degree, and victims being able to share their story, even though the defense for Stuart Parnell and his brother, they fought very hard to make it such that the victims, the family of victims, would not be allowed to share their story in the courtroom. I was there. They still were fighting it, even though the court said no. These people will be able to share their story. We typically, yeah, even at conferences, we all go to a variety of conferences. There are many times, and I think there's a conferences are great, and I think they bring people together, and we can engage in discourse about it, and we can learn things about it. We can be inspired by others. But one of the things that I notice is that see a lot of the same people there representing the same companies, talking about the same things. There's nothing wrong with that. What I see often is the fact that here is this whole conversation about food safety, and you have food companies represented, and media represented, food magazines or whatever, and you have companies that sell products or services that are represented on stage. Where's the consumer on the stage? Where's the person telling about that true burden of disease, about their experience? I am often the only person at a conference that is not representing anyone other than consumers. And most of the time, it just gonna sound like I'm complaining there, but most of the time I'm paying my own way. I don't have a corporate credit card to make those, registration costs and stuff like that. And the registration costs are like, six, seven, $800 sometimes or whatever. So the point I'm making here is that perhaps the farther we get away from the consumer, and we're not including those victims in these opportunities to learn from them, to have them as a participant in the discussion, it's a bit of a disconnect. I will say this though, as much as I could easily say how many, conferences I attend, how many events I attend, 30 years after the event, it's very hard to, look at the idea of dealing with an aftermath and saying, am I ready to be at this stage, to be involved in this discussion 1 year, 5 years, 10 years after the loss of a child, kind of a scenario? It's very easy for me 30 years later, plus with my degrees in this area and my experience in this area, to bring this voice to the conversation. um, there's not a lot of other people like me out there. At the
Mm,
same time, it's easy for me to say, well, I don't want to be joined by a lot of other people, because that would mean that these are all the people that lost children due to mostly preventable food safety failures. But while can say that there's not a lot of other people out here like me that are solely representing consumers, with industry and within this community, um, I feel an enormous burden of responsibility in terms of I have to do it right. I have to do it effectively. I have to do it respectfully. I have to do it, um, with a level of integrity that is not just, well, of course Darin is integrity, or has integrity, or of course Darin will do this the right way. I have to ooze. I have to literally. go about and never assume that I can like let my guard down. I have to always assume that the eyes are on me in terms of if I am the voice or the face of consumers, the only voice or face of consumers in some cases, that I have to represent consumers again, not only just effectively and efficiently, but with utmost of respect. And that if I undermine my voice, I could essentially undermine all consumers' voices, all
Yeah.
consumer participation in the conversation, all consumer representation at the table, if you will. And I think that this is something, again, I have great pride in this opportunity to not only do this, but, when I'm doing this, to me, it goes back to this conversation of, yes, I lost my son, but I don't want anyone to ever think that my son lost his father. When I'm doing
Mhm.
this work, this is in a way, it's like I'm spending time with my son. I'm doing this in the idea of the legacy of my son. And I've even told industry that if you undermine your food safety legacy, you're also undermining the legacy of all the people who put their careers into food safety, and you're undermining my son's legacy. And I know that might sound like a very selfish thing to say, but that literally is, in addition to a handful of photos from 1991 and 1992, before the era of cell phones and taking photos on your and videos on your phone. Um, what do I have to hold on to? I have a few images, whatever images I see on TV, whatever video clips I see are used here and there, and the idea of the work that I put into my son's legacy, and the idea that perhaps, there was an article from the Seattle Times, right, like a day or two after my son died, and it said Riley's death, basically the legacy of the food safety legacy he leaves behind. And I had a hard time with this article because it's like he was 17 months old at his time of death, and how did he leave behind a legacy? And I've used that as a call to action, if you will, for 3 decades in terms of the idea of I have to help make this idea of my son's legacy come to fruition. And I think about that. It's one thing to talk about the idea of 30 years from now. I wonder what my role will be over the next 30 years. I didn't know what my role was going to be 30 years ago in terms of what will I be doing in the year 2023. Um, I wonder what my role will be in the year 2053.
Right. And it kind of always comes back to the rocking chair test, right? Where we're old men sitting on the porch in our rocking chairs and we're evaluating our lives and deciding whether or not we did what we were supposed to. And that everyone goes through that phase. For all of my relatives who have been going through that, my grandparents, parents, etc., that reflective part is critical, and it's coming for all of us. And you have to be able to look at that now and say, 30 years from now, what do I want? What do I want to be known for? What changes do I want to have brought forth into the world? And I think that's a great way to think about this, because we get so wrapped up in the technical aspects of what we do, microbiology and all these type of things, but it's all for a purpose. It's for people, right? It's to protect people and to have people happy and healthy and to live the lives that we're living. And protecting that is, as I say on the show a lot, it's a moral responsibility in what we do. There's so much more of that. And if in companies, if companies were actually brave enough, right, if they had a bad food safety failure and God forbid people were injured or hurt or worse, would they put those pictures up in their corporate headquarters and say, we need to remember these people, like you have your picture of your son, right? Those memories need to be kept alive. Just like the Jewish people say, never forget, right? There's a lesson to be learned here that we cannot unlearn. We always have to keep this in front of us, because if we don't, it's going to repeat itself, right? There's a reason that cliche exists. History repeats, if you don't pay attention, because as those generations move forward, that knowledge becomes academic and it becomes third person and it's not relatable. And we need to make sure that we keep that in front of people and make sure that they remember that. So within food companies, when things are being pushed too fast or equipment is not being cleaned enough, right? Those messages need to be brought forward. And it's exceptionally important, and it's why we do what we do.
Well, and there needs to be, when you hear about a company that has a failure, you'll inevitably hear the same thing. We're going to put someone in charge of this. We're going to review our protocols and our procedures. We're going to make sure that we invest in this, and we're going to retrain our employees. No one ever talks about training executives,
Hmm.
right? And you look at the idea of the ethics behind things when we prioritize return on investment or cost benefit analysis efforts, and we want to make sure that we're focusing on the next quarter's reports, profits, all that kind of stuff, and even higher. You look at Chipotle's outbreaks. And remember, the CEO at the time, even though here where there was billions of dollars in losses, it took over 15 quarters of New York Stock Exchange market um, trading for the company's stock value to return to its pre-event value. The CEO still earned his $15 million bonus at the end of that year because food safety was not any part of what was being measured in terms of that executive's performance. And when you go back to the idea of values, and beliefs, if you believe in food safety, and everyone can say you believe in food safety, but if they truly valued it, they would have tied food safety to that executive compensation somehow. And perhaps, you know, perhaps there would have been an opportunity to say, you didn't earn this $15 million because you allowed this situation to exist under your watch there. Um, you know, it's more than just the idea of the again, the short term or the local area. You got to look at the idea of the overall beliefs. Even after Chipotle, there were venture capitalist companies that came to me and said, we thought that this company was a sure bet. We would always tell people to invest because you look at their quarter after quarter returns, kind of a thing. But we realized we weren't asking the right questions, right? So here's the deal: if you value food safety, you ask the right questions, and you collect the right data, and you evaluate how you value food safety in a much progressive element than just waiting for something to happen and figuring out that your crisis management communication team will be able to put some spin on it and the American consumer will forget. Because the one thing we've seen with American consumers, especially over the last 30 years with the development of social media, especially over the last number of years with the pandemic, is that consumers know a lot more today than they knew 30 years ago, and they're invested. They're actually considered to be stakeholders now in food safety, much more so than ever before. And
Yeah.
that where you might want your consumer base to forget, we don't forget. People don't forget Chipotle. People don't forget a lot of things. People don't forget Jack in the Box if they were around at the time. We've been talking about Jack in the Box for 30 years. Um, Even 3 decades does not necessarily make people. Consumers are completely different today than to go as our laws and policy. We're going to see more disruptors in food safety, and we'll continue to see a much more savvy and informed consumer base, and companies have to address that. But their leadership has to be of an ethical and corporate social responsibility, and a bigger understanding in terms of their role in this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, unfortunately, we're running out of time here today. But number one, I wanted to thank you for all that you do for food safety and making sure that we keep this in front of everybody, so that this message continues on for the next 30 years. And I think for everyone who's listening here today, thank you. And go home and think about this, and say, okay, all of these programs and systems and everything that I've developed are great, but how do I make food safety an emotional, personal connection within my company? How do I make sure that people are aware of this and our impact? And how do we keep these things from ever happening? And how can I teach executives? Because remember, executives have very abstract roles. They're thinking about things at a very high level all the time. And we need to bring them back to earth and make sure that they remember these key lessons. There's much more to think about than the P&L. And we need to help them understand that. And that's why we do what we do. So think about that and take that away. And thanks again, Darin, for being here. And
Thank
everybody,
you.
yeah.
Thank
And
you.
oh, there is a really cool event that you've got coming up here on March 8th with GFSR. GFSR, yes, Global Food Safety Resource, where you're doing with Dr. D, which I love. I think
Yep.
is great.
Eye on
So,
food safety with Dr. D, and we're going to be also looking at the 30th anniversary from a different perspective, and I'll be talking also, and I want to mention this here before we go too, how much inspiration I've gained from food safety leaders over the years. I couldn't do what I do over the last 30 years if I wasn't supported and you know, really gain inspiration from so many incredible people I've worked with over time. So thank you to everyone.
yeah, absolutely. And everything we're talking about, this when we talk about food safety culture, this is it, right? This is it. So everybody, enjoy your weekend. Have a lot of fun. We'll see you back here for the next live stream. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. And it's at the same time. So Friday next week at 8 a.m. Mountain, 10 a.m. Eastern for the next chat. So have a lot of fun, everybody. Thank you for spending this hour with us. We greatly appreciate it. And it shows your commitment to food safety as well. So good for you. So we'll see you back here next week and have a great time. Thanks again, Darin.
Thank
See you
you.
later.